to our third visit for getting started on your piece of Texas. And I have a few things I want to share. Like I said before I pass it along, I am Marvelyn Granger, president of the Fayette Prairie chapter of Native Prairie Association of Texas. And Connie Shorties, our Zoom education director, will be with us tonight to make sure that technology cooperates and to watch for your questions that you can put in the chat as we go along. Feel free to say hello in the chat, share with us where your prairie is at and what county you're in. And then as you think of questions, go ahead and put them in the chat while you're thinking of them so you don't forget, and we can kind of keep an eye on them and make sure that you get all of the answers that you would like. If you were with us for the first two episodes of this series, we are so glad that you are back. This is the part 3 of a 4-part series. We have 3 Zoom in this series, and then we will have an in-person capstone at the end. And this part 3, where we will discuss how to balance multiple uses and possibilities for your rural property, that balances your commitment to conservation with the other things that you also value. If you missed either of the first 2 episodes of this series, or you would like to revisit them or share them with others, you can find the recordings on our website at texasprairie.org under the Fayette Prairie chapter page. And I'll post these links to chat for you. A brief intro to NPAT. We've been working since 1986 to protect and care for prairies through conservation, stewardship, community. And right now, NPAT is conserving over 7,000 acres of native prairie. This is in addition to the private land being protected by landowners and members like you. Our Fayette Prairie chapter members care a lot about saving native prairies through stewardship and through education. And I welcome you to join our chapter community if you've not already done so, or renew your membership. And I'll leave links for that also in the chat. NPAT offers a few landowner programs that I wanted to be sure to share with you this evening. The Fayette Prairie chapter's Smaller Acreage Restoration Program, or SARP, offers resources to assist members with prairie restoration efforts and cost sharing, technical support, education, access to equipment, and chapter resources promoting effective restoration and long-term prairie maintenance. And this is specifically geared for those who have properties under 25 acres. We also have a Conservation Easement 101 workshop coming up on July 22nd. It is based in Fort Worth, so if you happen to be in that area, I'm sure that chapter would welcome you. And our North Texas Conservation Easement cost assistance is also available to eligible landowners in North Texas. All of these you can find on the website, or I'm happy to answer questions if you want to shoot me a text or an email or a chat. So tonight, Chase Brooke will continue our series by offering ideas for identifying and balancing your priorities and objectives on your own land. And as a reminder, this series will conclude with an in-person class and land tour capstone on September 18th, based in Brenham. Space for that is limited because we will be going on to private lands and having these discussions in person with Chase. But there are a few spots available. And so if you're wanting to join us for that, I ask you to, or encourage you to register quickly. Lastly, Chase will be utilizing the remaining time of tonight's presentation to answer as many questions as possible. So continue to add your questions in chat as he presents. So we can get started. Chase Brooke is a small acreage program specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. He holds degrees in spatial science and ecosystem science and management, and he's currently pursuing a doctorate in rangeland, wildlife, and fisheries management. Chase served as agricultural and natural resources agent in Collin County. He has worked on his family ranch, and has experience in rangeland and small acreage land management. As you visit with Chase this evening, you can't miss noting his genuine passion and his commitment to not only land stewardship, but working directly with people who own their own land. And this has been such an interesting conversation, Chase, that has continued to help our Texas neighbors, whether they've been have property new to them or are responsible for stewarding their generational land, or even just considering is country rural land for them. So I wish I'd understood a lot of these ideas when we started owning land that you've presented, but I know that everyone here will benefit from hearing these, regardless of where they are on their journey. So I want to thank you for continuing our discussions tonight, and welcome, Chase.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for having me back. I will say before I share my screen, because as soon as I share it, I would lose the ability to see the whole room. If anyone can find it or put it in the chat, how many of y'all have been to at least one of the previous sessions? Just out of idle curiosity. I think I recognize a couple names, but I was just on a lark. Oh, all right, been to two of them. Well, I'm glad that you have been willing to come back to a third. Oh, excellent. All right. Yeah. No, I'm like I said, I'm kind of curious and appreciate those of you who have seen me talk or have heard me talk before to come and listen to me again. Hopefully, we'll have a chance to meet in person in September. And now I'll go ahead and share my screen. And there we go. So it should have popped up. And yeah, and so that kind of the last of these these online talks really, is focused on that multiple use component. And this is something I touched on a little bit in the very first talk, kind of on getting started with your, kind of that land ownership 101. And so today I'm gonna touch a little bit on some of the topics I mentioned in that very first presentation, but it's much more of a deep dive into really just how do we balance what we want to do with our property, right? Very seldom, if never, have I seen anyone who only ever wants to use their property for only one thing and one thing only. Even if that secondary use is just having a place to lie down on the ground and get sunburned, or have your dogs run around, stare at pretty flowers while you have goats in the background, whatever that is, we have this multiple use component to our management that, I think is kind of worth exploring and doing a deep dive into. And, y'all are along for the ride on this. So learning objectives. Yeah. For those of you who've been to these talks before, I love me my learning objectives. What are we going to talk about today? So really where I'm going to get started is just going back to touching this idea of goals, right? What do we want to do with our property, and exploring that, and how, what are those different uses that we're trying to balance and manage? And then we're going to go into understanding the natural resource capacity of a property, right? What are the actual resources we have that are going to be impacted by the uses we want, right? We're going to look at how we think about some of these trade-offs, and explore some, ideas of assessing outcomes and adaptive management and adaptive land management practices. And then I've got some pictures and a little case study where we're going to go through a property I found on Zillow, and we're going to, hopefully we'll be able to have this be a little interactive, but I'm fully prepared to just shout at the screen my thoughts on it and how we might balance different uses. But ought to be fun. So, again, as some of y'all may have heard in my very first presentation, the first thing when it comes to multiple use management is figuring out what those uses are, right? As a landowner or a land manager, we have a lot of opportunity and variety in how we could manage a property, right? Especially if you are the landowner, unless it's like objectively bad or illegal, you can abuse your property, right? It is your prerogative to do with it as you will. We would all prefer, I would prefer that you know, are, I mean, for those of you who are here, you're obviously interested in some way in being good stewards of your land and conservationists, and I encourage you to keep that up. But it's very much, you know, how do we first lay everything out on the table in terms of those uses, right? You know, and a lot of that I think comes from, you know, these, like, we usually have the big ideas. Like, I have a property, I want to see birds, I want to engage or have some kind of interaction with wildlife, I want to have cows, I, you know, want my dog to have acres to run on, whatever that is, right? You know, what are these big, you know, big ideas, these big uses, and then it starts to split out into, you know, secondary or tertiary ones. Like, yeah, you know, I want to have, I bought this property to put cows on, but I also really enjoy, you know, seeing turkey, or maybe I like hunting dove, or, you know, whatever the, you know, not every goal or use has the same priority or prominence, but being able to put them on the table is a good start. I think too, it's very much the who, you know, making sure we're bringing everyone who has a stake in the property into this conversation, right? I think I used this example in the first talk I gave, but you know, the way that the uses I have for the family ranch and the joys and things that I get out of the property are going to be different than what my wife does, just by virtue of we have different hobbies, different personalities. We like generally, you know, we have a lot of things we enjoy doing similarly, but I enjoy going out and clearing brush and working on fence and stuff like that. Whereas my wife kind of wants a place where she can go kick back and relax and get away from, you know, just the busyness of life. You know, and and I think if we ignore one or the other set of goals in that, we're setting ourselves up for failure. Or at least some very hard conversations with, you know, maybe a little more emotional and investment in it. But also, you know, do your kids have, you know, if you have kids or grandkids, do they have some kind of stake in it, right? You know, do they have something, you know, uses for that property? Or maybe if you have joint ownership with a friend or a relative, you know, making sure, again, just everyone's at the table, put those cards down. And then and then to me, when I was thinking about the goals and this multiple use management question, it's what are the things that must be done and what are the things that we're kind of flexible on? Yeah, and I say that, like, for instance, if we want livestock on the property, does it have to be cattle? Are we open to exploring goats? Do we have to own them? Are we open to leasing? You know, if we are hard charging for wildlife management, you know, are we only managing for white-tailed deer and that's the only thing we care about? You know, or are we managing for bobwhite quail, you know, and turkey, you know, or do we care more about migratory game birds than we do ground nesting ones? Again, right? You know, we could come up with laundry lists of different uses, but it becomes really important later on when we start thinking about, you know, the resources we have on a property. Because at the end of the day, we need to know what we must get done and then how we adapt those other uses around it to a certain degree, or how we adapt the uses we have to the resources we have. I also think too, it's what is the long-term goal for the property, right? I always like to think of things, what do we want to get done this month, 6 months from now, 1 year, 5 year, 10 years down the road? You know, and that might not necessarily change our uses for the property, but it helps determine that end state and that end goal, right? If we have, you know, trying to think down in y'all's neck of the woods, you know, if we're trying to get towards more of a oak savanna kind of system, but we're currently choked up in, you know, shrub and eastern red cedar and oh my gosh, Ilex vomitoria. It is called. I'm just having a total brain fart. In any case, you're choked up in brush and understory, and you want to get it to a post oak savanna. right? Maybe that initial go if we want to eventually get cows on there, that might not be something we get done initially, but we need to start setting up the pieces to get there long term, right? So maybe we can use that property for something else that still brings us the joy of being on the property and working there, but is still working towards that long term goal. And then I can't see what people are putting in the chat. I do get a little pop up that says that there is stuff in the chat. I'll probably take a little break here in a minute when I get to the end of the section, then we'll address any questions that have popped up. If y'all are just having running commentary, that works for me too. Doesn't matter. All right. So, so we talk about what are these different goals and what are these possible uses. I do like to think, when we think of these goals and land uses, a lot of it, I like to put into the terms of consumptive and non-consumptive use, right? Which is simply, consumptive use means that we are actively utilizing or removing, or, there's a part of the natural resources that are being consumed in the process of this management, right? Livestock are eating grass, or forage. If we have those livestock that we are harvesting for meat or selling for income, then we are taking something, that use is extracting something from the property. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but that does mean that if we have a lot of consumptive uses, we need to balance what is being consumed by whom. Whereas non-consumptive uses, generally don't have the same, direct land impact that those consumptive uses do. Again, it not exactly rocket surgery, but it is something to keep in mind, right? If we have cattle, we can have cattle and enjoy the aesthetics at the same time. Family history is very important, especially for those of us, who may have family land with family history attached to it. That is valuable. That is something that should be preserved. But that doesn't necessarily, your family history and ties don't change the effective stocking rate of the property or how much grass you're producing, right? I would say also there's income based, non-income based. Are we trying to make money? If so, how much? I'm not going to go into the whole farm and ranch economics side of things, but it is just, again, keeping in mind, what are we wanting to do? Is this actively using the resources on the property, and do we need it to make money or not? I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the ag or wildlife valuation. This is, whether it's a reason you bought the property or not, this is often something that, we have to most people take into account, right? Hopefully it is not the sort of Damocles that is hanging over your head constantly that you must meet in order to keep your property tax valuation. But it is something that, provides significant, property tax benefits, right? For those of you who may not be as familiar with it, I will, as you can see, it is not an exemption. You are not exempt from any taxes. You have to pay your taxes on the property. But what it does mean is you're being taxed on a reduced value based on the agricultural productivity of the property, right? Every county and every county's appraisal district will have different standards for what qualifies for the ag use valuation. Some might have minimum herd sizes, or they generally falls under a certain intensity of use. If you're going to get an ag use valuation for growing pecan trees, they're going to want to see X number of trees per acre. Now with that is we do have the wildlife use conversion for our property tax valuation, right? So that's taking a property that's in the ag use valuation and converting it to wildlife use. You maintain the production value. You're being taxed on the agricultural productivity value of that property that you're paying under the ag valuation. But it gives you, in some ways, different guidelines and opportunities to manage that land. This is a whole full day workshop in and of itself if we wanted, but it suffices to say you need to have a wildlife management plan. You don't have to have a biologist write it. Everything you need is online on the TPWD website. But where this comes in is, when we think about that ag and wildlife valuation, which should we choose? What works for the property you have? What works for the goals you have? I mean, and it kind of goes back to your land and what you want to do. I know a lot of times there are a number of properties that if you don't mind the additional work of maintaining that wildlife use valuation and the different requirements of your wildlife management plan, one of the big benefits is it takes away the intensity of agricultural use if that's an issue, right? If you have a property that's overgrazed, the last thing what you really might need to do is take the livestock off to give your grass a chance to recover. But if your ag use valuation requires a minimum number of animal units or minimum number of cows, that can put you in a tough spot. So this wildlife valuation might be a way where, okay, we're going to manage for white-tailed deer. We'll keep grazing cattle, right? You can have livestock and you can still use a property agriculturally under wildlife use valuation. But it takes away some of the, stocking stresses, I guess, that might come with the ag use. I will say, I've gotten a lot of questions. Is the wildlife use valuation the easier one? I don't necessarily think it's easier. I think it just changes the priorities, right? Instead of, managing X number of livestock on the property, we're investing that money into supplemental feed or supplemental water or predator control. So we're still having to put in effort. It's just in different flavors. And so real quick, before I go on to the natural resource capacity part of it, any questions that pop in? Oh, no, I do see someone. Yeah, that was, yes, Yopom. Thank you, Trey. That was the word. Fun fact, I'm not a big, I'm not a huge plant ID guy in the sense that I don't have just tons and tons of species memorized. So the fact that I actually remember the scientific name before the common one, I'm actually rather pleased with myself because that's not usually the case. Any case, so we have our goals, right? We have these motivations. What do we want to do with this property? What are these different multiple uses that we want to bring together, right? And to me, when I was thinking about this, really that next step is like, okay, so we know what we want to do, right? Now we got to figure out how we're going to slice the pie, right? Or cake or pizza. Use your food of choice that you usually split with other people, right? Because, when we look at a property, it has a finite amount of resources, right? We get a certain amount of rain. Our plants are going to give a certain amount of productivity. We have a certain amount of output of productivity that we can expect from this from this land. And so then it really starts to focus on this idea of, okay, how do we know what we have so we can start splitting it up or figuring out how these different uses are going to impact those natural resources. And the end goal is that if we know what we have, and then we can adapt how we want to use it to the availability of these resources, we're avoiding overutilizing or the potential degradation of the land, right? And especially, to me, it's also very much this process of just looking at the property, right? When you are out on the land, whether you own it, whether you manage it, whether you just volunteer on it, it's always keeping an eye out, right? One of the most powerful tools we have is the Mark I eyeball right here. The more that we actually go out and we look at the property, the sooner, the better we can keep our finger on the pulse of how it's going. And if there are any issues that start to pop up, we can address them early and quickly. before they start, a small problem is going to be cheaper and easier to fix than a big one, right? Um, and so that's where, again, the eyeball, especially if you're on the property, boots on the ground, that's probably your best bet. If you're looking for property, or if you're trying to just get a general idea of what is available, we also have a lot of online tools that you can use. There are public records through the appraisal district as to how it might have been, maybe not super specific, but you could see, was it managed for wildlife in the past, for different agricultural uses? Was this a cornfield 20 years ago? And that might explain why we're seeing certain characteristics today, et cetera. Um, and so, like, for example, and we'll be going in a little more depth on this. This satellite image on the left is from a property I found on Zillow today down near Lampasas. And so, if this was a property that I owned or I was looking to buy, there are a lot of different ways that we can take a look at it and say, even just looking at this without any fancy tools, you can start making judgments, on how this property may or may not suit different uses. So, oh, come on, there we go. And I think too, with that is understanding what parts of our property can we manage, what parts are out of our control, right? So, the things that we cannot control are, we cannot change the soil, we cannot change the climate, we cannot change the water, right? We cannot change how much it rains, on any given year. If you can, please tell me. You could probably make a lot of money, making or predicting weather in Texas. And then on the other hand, there are things that, characteristics that we inherit, but we can change, right? So the vegetation we have, the use of the property, the disturbance that may be there, we can change and adapt those based on what we want to use that property for, right? And I mentioned this mainly from the aspect of, like, for example, most of Texas and our soils, you're going to be unless you're in East Texas, you're mainly going to be dealing with a lot of clay and a lot of limestone, right? Which means we have very alkaline soils that are going to be very heavy and drain somewhat poorly. We're not going to be able to change that, right? And so are we going to spend a lot of our effort in making, trying to change something that we can't, or can we put that towards more productive uses? And before I start diving into specific resources, it's always like, as I said earlier, this multiple use management is figuring out how big of a pie we've got, and then how are we splitting it out between the different uses we have. Because a lot of times these resource needs come with trade-offs, right? Are we adding more cattle? If we do, is that going to impact our quail population? Right? If we are managing for white-tailed deer, would adding X number of goats reduce the amount of forage available for those deer, right? And so when we think of those resource trade-offs, a lot of it, kind of that first category I think of is just forage, water, and animals, right? We're going to talk about that a little bit and how and exploring that. I'm not going to dwell on, but the other big trade-off we have to deal with is the cost, right? Everything costs time, effort, or money. So how are we going to spend our time? Can we put a little more money into hiring contractors to reduce the amount of effort that we have to put into it? Or are we, maybe I'm just a glutton for punishment and I like to clear all my land by hand with a chainsaw, and saves me a bit of money, but it's going to take a lot more effort and a lot longer time. These are all trade-offs that we have to make, right? And of course, those trade-offs vary. We might be more forage limited than water, right? We might have more competition for our time than our money, or maybe our money than our time, or maybe we don't have time or money, and then we're just trying to scratch it out and figure out how we're going to make it work in the meantime, because that's life. And it kind of goes back to the, I think in economics, it's, the opportunity cost, right? If we're going to spend the money to clear our brush now, what does that mean? That what could have we used that money for that we're not going to be able to, right? If we clear that brush this year, does that mean we're putting off fixing fence until next year? Does that mean we're going to limp along an old fence for a couple more years until we can pull the money back together, right? It's all a balancing act. And I know that's kind of obvious, but to me, it's one of those, the more we explicitly think and talk about those different trade-offs and opportunity costs, the easier it is to start setting that priority list, right? So, we're balancing that how our resources are being split, and then we're also arranging the priorities of what we're trying to get done. And so going into some of the specific resources, I think usually probably the most visible of these resources that we're trying to balance is forage, right? It's the plant community and the plant community structure we have. And so a lot of times this is, split between three different forage types, right? We have grasses, we have forbs, and we have browse. Browse just being, woody plants tissue that, critters like to eat. Forbs are basically non-grassy weeds, and grasses are self-explanatory. And so the arrangement and the quantity and type of forage we have, that's what we really, that's one of the basic resource management concerns in multiple use, right? So when we think about what do deer like to eat versus cattle versus goats versus sheep, and making sure that we're not overutilizing any one forage source across those species. It's also worth noting all animals contribute towards this forage competition, right? And so when we're thinking about this trade-off, we need to make sure we're accounting for that full species grazing load, and then making sure, and this all just goes again back towards that idea that we don't want to exceed the productive capacity of that land, right? We always want to make sure that we're staying within that sustainable management rate or the carrying capacity, right? And and just to review carrying capacity, that's the sustainable ratio of animals to forage, right? So on any given year, we expect to produce X number of pounds of forage per acre. And then our stocking rate is, excuse me, at this point in time, how many animals are we choosing to put on that forage? And then the effective stocking rate is what the animals we're choosing to put on there, plus the consumption from other animals and wildlife on the property. And so this goes, again, just kind of reviewing, when we think about these animals as well, we can't talk about forage management and balancing animal use and wildlife use if we don't talk about the animal unit, right? The animal unit is just kind of a standardized way of thinking about critters, in that it's about 1,000 pounds of animal that consume about 26 pounds of forage per day, right? So generally speaking, it's how many of X species equal one cow. And you can see this little chart over here on the right. About 5 sheep is an animal unit equivalent. If you live in West Texas, the elk, is about 6/10 of an animal unit. I did the math once. If you were curious, it's about 6 alpaca per animal unit equivalent, or 500 guinea pigs, or I think it's about 10,000 grasshoppers. Seriously, and it is funny, but when you think about it, in a drought year like this time of year in Texas, grasshoppers can eat and consume a prodigious amount of forage. And if you're not careful, that can seriously impact our grazing ability, right? And so, again, there's some math we can do with that. I'm not going to go into an animal unit talk so much as, first, we have different kinds of forage that different animals like. Now we have different animals that consume different amount of forage on a per head basis, which means we get to then compare, okay, so for a certain kind of forage, what animals like to eat what, right? And so different species have different preferences. You can see if you look on the left-hand graph here, blue is grass, orange forb, gray is browse, right? So cattle eat predominantly grass, about 75% grass, about 15% forb, and the balance is browse, right? So they're predominantly grass eaters. And if we look across this graph, we can see that horses and bison are almost obligate grass eaters. So if we're managing for cattle and we have horses, we have two different uses that are competing for the same forage type, right? And so when we think about then how much grass we're producing, if we have both these animals, we can't have full stock, fully stocked to carrying capacity of um, cattle and then add the horses on top of it, right? We need to balance those two herd sizes to make sure we're accommodating both their forage needs. On the other hand, that also means that if we wanted to be strategic about our forage, we can look at utilizing multiple species, or again, in this example, you can see like white-tailed deer eat predominantly browse, right? So if we have cattle and white-tailed deer, they're not competing for really much of the same forage. But if we had goats and white-tailed deer, they would be. Or we could have cattle and goats and stock them more intensively than we could cattle on their own or sheep on their own. The graph on the right is just, it's another way to think about it, right? So instead of splitting it out by species, or splitting it out by forage type. So if we think about grass, the taller the bar, the more that those species would compete for that forage type. And again, just a different way of kind of thinking about it. But in the big picture, we would want to make sure that we're balancing our different forageability and type, forage type and species. There's also a whole other pathway to explore when we think about wildlife specifically in terms of forage types for different kinds of birds and animals and omnivores and all these other things that when I started going down that rabbit hole, I realized that would be probably more than we would want to fit into a single presentation like this. But hey, that might be a good follow-up workshop or something like that. So thinking about forage and the competition for forage, the other thing we need to consider is water, right? Water is a majorly limiting resource in Texas. And, we want to make sure we're within our water budget as well. And so when we think about these different uses, like from an animal perspective, obviously your water use is going to vary based on time of year. The hotter it is, the more water they need and drink. But if we're thinking about and trying to plan this out, then, consider that, for cattle, for example, most non-dairy cattle are going to need about at least 15 gallons of water per head per day, right? Horses need 12, sheep and lambs too, etc. And if we live on the property as well, or we have a residence there, we're going to use water as well, right? The rule of thumb is 26 gallons per person per day, but obviously that increases the more people we have. You can see this chart on the top right that gives an idea of, like, based on just plain bedrooms and bathrooms, how many gallons how many gallons of water might be needed to be provided. Similarly, if we're thinking about adding turf and irrigation, that can add hundreds and thousands of gallons of water per day it's being run, right? So, where do we get this water from? Really there's three different sources, right? We have surface water, groundwater, and rainwater, right? Surface water is the streams and rivers, very, very uncommon across most of Texas. Stock tanks, which are fairly common if they hold water year round. And, maybe you might have an ephemeral creek or something like that. Of those, as a landowner, the only one the only one you really don't need a permit to pull from yourself is a stock tank or lake you own entirely on your own property. You need permits to pull from rivers and navigable streams and all that. Surface water is generally, again, on the farm and ranch, going to be the stock tank or pond. Groundwater, that one, is highly variable. Some parts of Texas have lots of groundwater and it's easy to access. A lot of Texas has groundwater that is unusable and easy to access, and some parts of Texas just don't have groundwater that you can really get to. I would say a lot of the water issues we see on a community-wide basis tend to come from groundwater, especially in Central Texas. But even again down near Corpus Christi, right? They're running out of groundwater, they're running out of surface water. we're seeing these water resource and water sourcing issues popping up across the state. The last one is rainwater. I think rainwater is probably the one that is the most underutilized on the land and across the state. I think a lot of people underestimate the amount of water you can generate off your property per year, right? I think, and I'm trying to remember, I was talking to our local water district staff. It's something like, 1 inch of rain generates, I think 2 or 2+ gallons of water per square foot of roof area or catchment area, right? So when we think about the amount of rain we might get, being able to capture that water and store it for use and on the farm or ranch can actually be a very significant amount of water to use. And even if it doesn't cover your entire use case, it can take a lot of pressure off of your well or off of your other water sources as well. That again, if you have questions about it, I've learned that I really like talking about ag rainwater harvesting because it's cool. But I think at the end of the day, it's just, kind of the taking a step back out. Those are three areas that we access water, right? Maybe I say four. There might be a fourth. You might have municipal water, but that's not necessarily common across every property. Especially the more rural you get, the less likely you are to be able to get city water. If you have it, that's awesome. But also, you might not necessarily be using city water to water your livestock. But again, kind of big picture idea is, the more that we understand how much water we need, then we can plan our water sourcing around it, right? So, for example, our livestock might be using, if we have a trough or maybe the stock tank on the bottom right, when we think about what all is using it, obviously you see the cattle in the pictures, but if we wanted to use it for wildlife or as a landing area or nesting site for waterfowl, we would probably manage the shoreline around that pond differently. We'd probably try to lower the stocking rate. That looks pretty grazed, right? We'd pull some animals off, let that grass grow taller, try to improve the shoreline in terms of vegetation, height, type, and arrangement to create better nesting habitat. And we would be adapting that pond or stock tank management to, again, we'll still let the cattle drink out of it, but we also want to make sure that we're allowing the those waterfowl to land. Or if that maybe one of those multiple uses is getting feral hogs out, right? Are there ways that we can exclude them, fencing wise, hunting pressure, trapping, things like that. Just different ideas, different ways to think about it. I can't talk about water without talking about drought. I'm not going to dwell on it, but just remember, Texas is a state of drought that occasionally gets rain. On average, we are more likely to get less than our average rainfall than we are more. I think when we think about forage, we think about water, we think about our different uses. Just when in doubt, plan on drought. I need to put that on a sticker. But if we plan on drought and we get rain, we're happy. If our land planning requires rain for us to be successful, then we're setting ourselves up for a really hard time. All right, so we talked about resources, we talked about some different balancing and some different uses. And I think at the end of the day, the last kind of cap on this whole resource-based discussion is just understanding those impacts and outcomes, right? And it's just, and again, like a lot of this, it's not necessarily something that's complicated, or it's as complicated as you want to make it. But I always encourage landowners and folks to just at some point stop and assess. Did I like how this went? Am I balancing these different uses? Are the things that I'm doing on this property meshing well? Are they not meshing well? Are there any friction points that we weren't expecting? Did clearing all this brush change the wildlife species that we see on the property in a good or bad way? Was it worth the amount of effort it took? Right? Would you do it again? If you did it again, what would you change? Right? And it, yeah, not necessarily rocket surgery, but it is something that I think, when we talk about multiple uses, it's just having this touch point where I think, am I getting out of this what I need? Turning to my wife or to my co-owner or cousin or whomever, and like just saying, hey, is this working the way you thought it would? I think it might be. Do you think so too? Right? I know that interpersonal communication, it makes the world go, it makes the world run, but the sooner we can kind of keep tabs on that and understand the land outcomes, but also the people outcomes, the easier we can address any issues early on. All right, and then just kind of and with that too is just remember, you got to keep it flexible, right? I like to call it adaptive land management, but it's just, the land is always going to be changing. It's always dynamic. Some years we get more rain, some years we get less. Some years we might have 50,000 grasshoppers come through and we need to change our stocking rates because of it. Or maybe who knows what those different things might be. But, just keeping, again, it goes into that goal question, what is flexible and what is not? And even then, if it's not flexible, like we must have livestock, it's paramount that we have flexibility in how we stock those animals, or with wildlife species, being flexible and addressing their habitat needs as they come up, right? And so with that, all right, we're going to get into some pictures, and I'm going to need to pull the chat up now because actually, before we run into this, I'm going to pull up the questions. All right, so I did.
Chase, I'm happy to I've kind of been keeping up with them. I'm happy to
Oh yeah,
just kind of sort them out for you. Um,
sure.
yeah, Axel asked whether there are satellite imaging tools that you prefer or that are good to use to analyze land.
I'll talk about that in just a second because I've got an example of how we're going to do this. I
Okay.
will say the very short answer is honestly my first go-to if someone asks me something about a property is I like to pull it up on Google Maps. Google Earth works really well because it's free and you can look at satellite imagery over time and see how something has changed, right? So even like in this slide, this is Google Street View over the course of what is that, 22 years. You can see how the land has changed over time. So if you're buying the land in 2023, you can see it didn't have a brush issue 22 years beforehand, and it's been slowly encroaching. I know that's not necessarily a super fancy, high speed kind of tool, but honestly, it's cheap. I mean, it's free. It's easy to access. And then I'll go over some of the more specialized tools in a minute.
Okay. And then Royce had a question on ag exemptions, whether they could be, you could qualify for them for the kind of non-standard ag, like cultivating yaupon leaves for tea or farming insects.
I would say my go-to answer or my short answer for that is always going to be talk to your appraisal district. Every appraisal district has different standards and for intensity of use. Every appraiser is going to interpret them slightly differently as well, right? And they're going to be the ones who can give you that final yes or no of how it fits. What I would say is, think about, if they're giving an agricultural use valuation for the productive economic use of that land for an agricultural purpose, right? So if they're giving out an ag use valuation for yaupon, for foraging or growing yaupon for tea, they're going to want to see substantial amounts of like acres of yaupon that are actively being used for that harvest. Similarly for farming insects, like I'm going to say that one in particular, probably not, because you're very not unlikely to have, at least in my familiarity with insect ranching for human consumption, that it tends to be, that's not a free range insect harvesting deal, right? That's going to be a much more concentrated kind of operation, rather than taking a net and sweeping acres of property for grasshoppers or insect proteins. But again, I don't know your county, talk to your appraiser. I would say that might be a good use case for having a wildlife valuation that gives you the flexibility to pursue those other foraging or non-traditional agricultural interests, without the pressures of qualifying for a more strict traditional agricultural use valuation. Just again, that's where my mind first kind of goes with it. But again, talk to your appraiser. In my experience, they would much rather answer those questions upfront and early than in the middle of protest season, or when things are much more stressful and people are getting letters in the mail and stuff like that.
Okay, well, those are the two questions that have come up so far.
Cool. All right, so we're going to hit some pictures here, and then we're going to go into a little case study. It is 6:53, so we're going to go through these pictures a little bit fast. So the picture side of things, again, just from a multiple use perspective, how useful is this property right here in this picture, right? If you can, for those of you who are able to, I would love for your interactions in chat. First impressions on this, right? This is a hard property to get, even one use for, right? This is not great habitat. This is not great grazing land. If we are thinking about how we're using this property, we would really need to consider how we're going to change that intensity of our use to match the state of the property while we're getting it to where we want to be. And so similarly with this one, right? Anybody want to either unmute yourself and talk, or maybe punch in the chat? What would this property be useful for? Maybe what would this not be useful for?
It would be useful in its current state for harvesting prickly pears.
Yeah, hey.
Or the pads.
Yeah, the pads or the little tunas. Those you could forage a lot of those little tunas off there. Probably wear your snake boots. But yeah, that'd be, you could certainly get a lot of foraging off that. It's also probably good. There are certainly going to be some wildlife benefits to this, right?
Right.
And a lot of times people don't recognize it, but this area, while hopefully the whole property doesn't look like it, if you've got animals or livestock and you've got severe drought, you can go in with a propane burner, burn the spines off the prickly pear pads, and that's your drought forage, right? Animals will eat it if you burn the spines off.
Right.
Thank you, Royce. Let's see. I think I saw Marv in the chat. Would quail want to hide in there? Potentially, right? I think it might have too much, like it might be a little bit brushy for some quail, but certainly could be escape habitat. Prickly pear might be a good deterrent for bigger critters to, chase after them. Oh, there we go. What about this one? What are your impressions? What do you think? What are some uses that would work well together, or maybe not?
It seems to be predominantly grass. So if you had animals like horses that are predominantly going to forage on grass, that would be a good spot.
Yeah. No, I agree. It'd be good for, maybe some ground nesting birds. Yep. Just as I said that, Marv dropped it in the chat, Marglin. And, things that might not be as this might not be as useful for. Um, well, if you're trying to grow a rice paddy, it's probably not a good spot. But you might also think like this, especially without any, infrastructure on it. If you had a kid who really liked riding a dirt bike, that would be pretty treacherous to ride just bust trails in a dirt bike through because you couldn't see over the tall grass. You know, um, but let's see. This is a picture out in Marfa. I always like this because it's just a pretty landscape, but also this is actually this was a very productive year out in this is great for art. Thank you. Good job. Thank you, Trey. But this was a high rainfall year and they got 300 pounds of forage per acre. They were super excited about this.
Wow.
So when we think about those multiple uses, that might be more of that, you got more of those antelope or the elk, sorry, and maybe bighorn sheep, less on the intensive livestock grazing.
Solar farm?
Solar farm, maybe, right? Depending on the soil. I mean, I'll be honest, I know there's a lot of contention around solar farms, among other things, but putting 30 acres of this of a 640 acre property under a solar farm might give you enough capital to be able to really do good work on the other 610 acres, right? I know that's not always a super popular opinion, but it is it might. All right. And so I mentioned it earlier. We're going to talk a little bit about this property I found on Zillow today. And kind of where these last images were like, oh, initial impressions. We're going to do a little more of a deep dive on how we can look at a property and assess some of these resource side deals. I think that goes back to some of Axel's question on tools and stuff like that, right? So to give you a little bit of background, I found this today. It was on Zillow. I took some screen caps. If you had $4.5 million you wanted to spend out near Lampasas, maybe this is your dream property. 680 odd acres. And you can see on the satellite image, and from the listing photos that were screen capped there, we'll look at the satellite image first. So you can look at it, and what I can tell you, I think I can draw in this. I've got a laser pointer. Can y'all see this laser pointer?
Yeah, yes.
Oh, heck yeah. Man, we're living in 2026 today. So I can tell you, we've got some different resource areas. Obviously this area is more heavily treed. Looks like we might have some stock tanks here. We've got a stock tank there. We've got some roads going around. I don't really see much that would, there might be a fence line right here. It's kind of hard sometimes to tell interior fencing and infrastructure on the property. But I could tell you from this photo alone, we've got, some bare ground. We've got a certain, it's probably mostly grass. There's a decent amount of brush around there and some more closed canopy forest kind of in that top north side. If we look at the satellite imagery, of course, they're going to put the prettiest pictures first. It looks like we've got a windmill. We've got an old pila, an old barn over there. It looks like there's kind of a little house or farmhouse complex. And I can't tell if that's supposed to be a creek or one of those stock tanks, but we can tell just up front without using any fancy tools. I could tell you this is it probably was grazed for cattle in the past. It's got in the pictures it might have been kind of grazed a little bit hard. You can see the cows in this picture right here, but it's not necessarily a tall grass prairie, but there is grass present. And so thinking about this, we're probably, the main use was cattle grazing. If we were coming in here and wanting to add the wildlife component, we're looking at either, changing the grazing system to add more, more grass cover or increase the height and the type of grass species, maybe do some woody plant cover, or just a little bit of land, kind of brush scaping a little bit, to improve and streamline the brushy habitat over here to create preferential areas for maybe turkey or deer, right? Just again, initial impressions just from these photos. Now, if we want to go and dive a little bit deeper, there's a program called the Rangelands Analysis Platform. And the next couple slides, we're gonna use two different tools. So one is looking at land cover, one is looking at productivity. So the first one looks at land cover. And I typed the website, it's literally rangelands.app. And what this is each of these images use the system uses satellite imagery to look at the percentage of different cover types, right? So the first one, the green one, is our perennial grass cover. So this is where, these are our desirable native grass species, are predominantly fall into this perennial grass cover, right? So as you would expect on the satellite imagery, we've got, the darker green is the more grass, the higher percentage of grass present. So that lines up with where we saw kind of that woody area here, kind of near some of these water sources, but we're not seeing tons of just like blank white spots. Then we look at the shrub cover. So this is, those little cedar shrubs and mesquite shrubs, that we kind of saw around the property. So that kind of checks out. We can see that there are some areas of increasing shrub density. And then we look at the last one in tree cover, right? The hotter the red, the more trees are present. So we can take that satellite imagery and then start looking at, okay, if we were looking at the complexity of tree cover and shrub cover, you can see that there's a pretty decent spread around, right? So if we were thinking ground nesting birds that like having escape cover nearby, we can, the shrub cover, we can kind of keep consistent or modify a little bit, but that generally dispersed shrub cover might give better, access to that escape habitat and stuff like that for those quail, whatever. Right. But when we think about tree cover and we think about like white-tailed deer, they like edge, right? They like the edges of, higher density, closed canopy forest. And so if that's what but they don't necessarily like walking through big open areas. So if we were looking at white-tailed deer, we can tell that they're mainly going to, they're most likely going to be up around here in this kind of northeast corner. So how does that fit with multiple uses? Well, maybe if we're grazing cattle, we could probably graze them a little more down here. If we're focusing brush cover, we are managing brush, we can do more brush treatment in these better grazing areas that maybe have better grass cover that we can encourage that revegetation on. And then in these areas where we have more of like the closed canopy tree cover, we're just, instead of clearing brush, we're just kind of scaping it into a more preferential habitat. And then we can flip it over. And so the other side of this tool is forage productivity, right? So this is land cover type and forage productivity. This is for that same outlined area. And what this does is it uses the satellite imagery to give us an estimate of how much forage production happened in the past. Right. So the average productivity of this property is 2,500 pounds of forage per acre. Right. And the absolute lowest it ever produced was about 1,200. The absolute highest was about 3,400. If you look on the graph at the bottom, the dark line is this year so far. And it shows us where we are on the range of productivity. Right. So far in 2026, this ranch is producing about average. It's running that average line pretty good. And if we look on this chart on the right, we can see, it then splits out this productivity into, herbaceous production, perennial forb production, and annual forb and grass production, right? So when we're thinking about those animals that like to graze on forbs or the animals that like to graze on grasses, we can see that perennial grass and herbaceous production, while there is a lot of annual variation, this year we're seeing a lot more herbaceous than perennial forb and grass, right? What does that mean? It means that over this time, you tend to see higher forb or herbaceous plant productivity when we're overgrazing or when we're suppressing that grass population. Otherwise, you'd see it much more neck and neck or probably slightly advantageous to the grass side. In the back, the blue bars, that's just annual precipitation, right? So we can see the fluctuation in these different forage types over time. Kind of cool, right? And again, if we were looking at buying this property, that gives us an idea. We can see in the pictures, it's probably been overgrazed. Recently we can look at these productivity charts and say, okay, yeah, we are seeing the probable suppression of grasses, which is giving us a higher herbaceous plant community load, which means that if we were buying this property, we would need to make sure that we're stocking the animals on it to that perennial grass production, not to this whole forage productivity level, right? And if this was our family property, that's a way that we can kind of check our assumptions a little bit. The next one I like to go through is soil. If we look at soil types, I don't know if any of y'all have ever played with Web Soil Survey or Soil Web, but that's another super powerful tool to give us, again, it helps adjust our expectations, right? We can look at the soils here, and in this area, it's predominantly a gravelly clay loam or, clay loam complex, and basically a lot of clay, a lot of rock. It's the hill country. It means that we're going to have a lot of areas with, kind of relatively poorly draining soil that are going to be challenging to, that they're just going to be rocky and all the limitations within there. It's also worth noting too, if we have, if you see this area with the W, if Web Soil Survey or the USDA carves out, that W is for water. If they carve out an area for water, that is a very good sign that that has water year round, right? If it does not hold water year round, like you see where these two stock tanks are, and they're not given that W designation, they're probably ephemeral. You probably cannot count on them for water in a drought or in the droughty times of year. So again, just kind of different ways to look at it. If you go into each one of these, I thought about doing a deeper dive into it, but again, time constraints. If you click, if I clicked on one of these in Web Soil Survey, it would give the full breakout of the soil description. One of the big things in there is it'll also tell you the suitability of that area for different uses, right? For timber production, for road building, for building a house. And just in terms of, is it more suitable, less suitable, highly suitable, terrible. And the last one too is water, right? The last of those big resources we were looking at, we could see pretty clearly, we've got 3 stock tanks. One of them has water in it, probably has water in it year round and consistently. These 2 over here probably are seasonal stock tanks. Without getting boots on the ground, I don't know if that's a matter of just size. Is it too shallow? Is the dam super leaky? Is it built on a gravel pit? Who knows? But again, if we were thinking about it from a land use perspective, that means that if we're in a dry year and we're trying to attract wildlife to the property, we should not expect them to hike all the way over here through this exposed area. They're probably going to the neighbor's stock tank on this side of the fence or something like that, right? So that's going to impact the movement of the animals on our property, the wildlife and the livestock and everything. One thing too, where this green circle is, that, we saw in the original imagery, there was a windmill there, and I put it in a different color because we don't know if it works, right? But it means that there is a well of some kind. And so that might give you the ability to pull groundwater from it, whether using that windmill or using a solar pump, pulling the windmill off, putting a solar pump in there. You also have, again, I probably should have just left it here. You have this standing pila, you have this little water tank here. If we were to buy this property and go in to refurbish it, refurbish the house or the barn, those would be very easy to tap into for rainwater harvesting. And basically routing water for storage in that pila, which we could then use for livestock, for household use, etc. Of course, if you're using it for household use, you would need a filtration system. They're not super complex, usually just a series of particle filters, a UV light filter, and you're off to the races. So again, overall, just kind of, again, a random example I pulled up a property and was kind of thinking about it. How would I assess these resources? How would that impact some of these uses? I think overall, kind of my conclusions, the property has it does have some, brush encroachment, has decent forage potential. Right. We could balance some livestock and wildlife. I think in the long term, we'd need to put in some work on managing that brush, making sure that our brush problem doesn't get worse, or maybe changing some of the species. Maybe I'd rather have juniper rather than mesquite, or maybe we want to, encourage new oak mott's to pop up and try to get live oaks to establish and, use that as our brush basis instead of these, cedar and mesquite trees. It does look like it's been overgrazed, so we're going to need to change and give that land some time to rest. We do have some exposed soils that are also very rocky, right? So we're going to have limited, productivity in terms of grass production and high erosion potential on hilltops and steep slopes. One of those areas that, we just would want to keep an eye on and make sure that we're not losing soil to erosion. But also those might be the areas where we would allow the brush to kind of exist, right? Go back to that historical landscape of, you would see the brush where the fire wouldn't go. So rocky hilltops and hillsides that couldn't grow grass and down in the creek bottoms. We do have water on site. The one thing I didn't mention this, the location of the water might be an issue, right? We talked about it with the wildlife, but if we cross fence this property, east to west, but the only good consistent water is in the south, that's going to have a huge impact on how we would rotate our animals, right? If we were going to do cross fencing, doing a north-south fence or splitting it into but different management units would allow us more consistent access to water for those animals over time. So again, overall, like I said, it's all about balancing, right? It's about how much do we have? How do we make sure we have enough for all the things we want to do? And how can we bring a clear assessment of what we want to do, what's more important, what's less important, what's more flexible, what's less flexible, and then integrate that into what our land can sustain and provide so that we can maintain that use in the long run. All right. I know y'all, I saw some questions. I'm more than happy to continue answering them.
Couple of questions, Chase.
Yes.
Royce had asked this question about with respect to watershed mapping, whether you recommended any particular topographic or surveying apps or tools.
I would say probably, and I can't remember if it's Texas Water Development Board or Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. One of them, they have floodplain maps. That's probably where I would go for that. I would also, honestly, frankly, the easiest way to get a lot of these maps, talk to your local NRCS office. They will be there. I haven't been on a site visit with them that they haven't brought all these kinds of maps with them. And if you were to ask, I'm sure they would be happy to generate them. If you want to find them independently, like I said, for the watershed stuff, TCQ, Texas Water Development Board, one of those two should have like a floodplain map with some topography stuff. And that's kind of where I would go in that regard.
Yeah, I would second that. The NRCS did that for our property years ago, and shortly after we acquired it, and we were astonished to learn that our property is the meeting point drainage area for hundreds of acres north of us, which we learned when there was a 7-inch rain one day, and it basically blew out every little land bridge we had built across our creeks. So, yeah.
Excuse me, didn't the NRCS become a different organization or it got renamed?
So they used to be the Soil Conservation Service, and they got renamed to the Natural Resources Conservation Service probably 20 plus years ago.
Didn't
But
that change again recently?
not that I'm aware of.
Okay, all
I mean,
right.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I might not have seen it.
I
But
could very well be wrong.
um, but yeah, at least their website's still the same.
And Royce, also, you had a question about the resources that Chase was using to actually do the analysis that he just showed us.
hmm Yeah, and that was again, it was kind of I pulled from those came from two websites, well, three, four, right? Analysis saying I looked at Zillow is probably not necessarily an analysis website, but the rest were done in, I mean, Google Maps, Rangelands analysis platform, which is at rangelands.app, website I put in the chat. And then the web soil survey, which I think Marblin put in there as well. So all of those are free. All of them are publicly available. You should not pay a dime for it. Mhm.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said great. I meant to mute this again.
Oh no, you're good. Um, but yeah, and I will also say, I mean, we have 5-10 minutes. If there are questions, general land management questions, things from previous sessions that maybe you woke up in the middle of the night and you were just jonesing to ask me and you knew I was going to be here tonight, don't be afraid to hit me with those too. The worst I can say is I don't know. So, yeah.
Chase in the Zillow, I noticed on the listing it said unimproved. Do you know what they're referencing when they say that? Are they talking about
Uh,
infrastructure?
so in terms of like on the Zillow listing,
Yeah, on the bullets right there yep.
yeah. So
That,
unimproved land is probably, yeah, I think that's more like realtor speak for it has not been developed into neighborhoods or pavement or commercial or anything like that.
okay. Probably nobody's living there,
Yeah,
maybe.
I think it's just also general farm and ranch land, I think kind
Yeah.
of falls into that. I
Okay.
That might be a Zillow term, but that I don't think it's strictly a I think that's just the industry term that, you know,
Yeah.
I guess unimproved to me is probably not the most representative of the actual utility and ecosystem services that land provides. But again,
Yeah.
I'm not a realtor. Um,
It probably didn't go where my mind went. I was thinking that they haven't planted improved what is called improved grasses, but they probably
yeah,
didn't go there. Okay.
yeah. Trey put in the chat. There's Rocked as an app for geology. Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of cool tools out there. Like and it's one of those things. These are what you saw are the tools I like to use. Um, Try them out. right? Try the different tools, find the ones that you like to use, the ones that kind of fit your use case. And, I'm a millennial. For me, I like working on like a computer or a laptop versus a phone. So like a lot of phone apps, I just don't like having tons of apps on my phone. And so I prefer to access things through a web browser. That's just a me thing. Not everyone's like that. But
Great.
it's more than anything else, I think it's a matter of just the tools you are comfortable using are the tools you will use, and if they are tools you use, that means you get benefit out of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I'm like, the best tool we have is just our eyeballs. Yeah, and honestly, that's a big part of just gonna kind of shill our program in September a little bit. That's kind of the goal of that workshop. It's land judging. We're gonna go train the eyeball. Gonna go look at grass and properties and learn about how landowners have translated their goals and their vision to their property and kind of where they are in that process. And ought to be fun.
It sounds like it. One quick question: in the example that you were using of the unimproved property, uh, in the center to upper left portion, there was a area of darker vegetation, but it
Mhm.
also was curved, kind of like contour farming, but probably not contour farming. What's your take on what that might be?
So yeah, good question. I think that to me looks like it might have been terraced in the past.
Yes.
And so, maybe not contour farmed, but I mean, it may have been a hay field. And they, but you're right. It wasn't a very natural sort of structure to it, but it was, they very likely, just kind of pulled, some material over, and it helps slow rainwater down, and all, kind of moderates the slope a little bit and allowed that space to be a little more productively used again, probably for hay, if I were to guess. Uh,
And it was effective because it is greener in that area.
yeah, that exactly. Usually, if the federal government's spending money on stuff like that, they're not going to spend it on a total boondoggle, or at least at the NRCS and those funding levels. So, uh, yeah, no, excellent observation. Any other last questions, comments, thoughts?
Um, where is this place in September?
Um, it is in Brenham.
Brenham.
I
Okay.
put the link in, it's the last entry in the chat, Royce.
Okay.
The link you can register for that for. It's in Brenham. We'll meet at the Rankin Center for just a recap of what we've learned and what we're going to go see. And then we'll go visit a couple of properties and kind of go through the same exercise that Chase took us through this evening of how do you look at a property? How do you decide what you're going to do? And how do you map that out and set your priorities? So it'll be a really great opportunity to visit with other people who have interest in this. And Chase has a colleague who's going to join us. And so it'll be a really good, just kind of a mental experiment of how do we go through this process and accomplish what we want to accomplish.
Great.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, appreciate y'all's time this evening and sticking through to the end on it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chase. This has really been such a terrific series of how to go through this process and how to identify what our priorities are. And each of us has one, a different property challenge, and two, different sets of goals. But they all kind of come down to doing the best with the land that we can. And I think we've all really enjoyed and appreciated the thought process and your expertise to all of those parts. So that's super
Yes, great
motivational.
presentation. Yeah,
Yeah.
great
Thanks so much.
presentation, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Royce.
Appreciate it. And then and also if you do wake up in the middle of the night with questions that you just are you got to get off your mind at 2 a.m. I did
That
put my
happens.
email address in the chat. I will tell you, if you email me at 2 a.m., I will be completely asleep. Wait to, when the next business day begins, you'll probably get your response. But don't be afraid. If you have questions, email me. If I don't know the answer, I'll make sure to connect you with someone who does. All right.
Well,
All
thank
right.
you so much, everybody. And the link is in the chat for to go back to watch if you missed any of the other presentations, so you can catch up and bring all of that with you to the capstone. So,
All right.
all right. Well, thank you, everyone. Reach out to Chase or Connie or I if you have any questions and want some more resources. I know Chase will respond quickly. He always does.
All right. Well, thank you all and have a good night.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Maybe my
All right.
toddler might already be asleep. We'll see.
Ooh. All right.
All
Good
right.
night.